Our markets live stream from Modo Energy. Today we're going to be talking about all things grid scale storage in the PJM market, covering most of the eastern U.S. and the mid-Atlantic. My name is Brant Vermillion. I'm our U.S. research lead here at Modo, and this is Diksha. She's leading on everything PJM for us here in the U.S. research team. So just to run through what the agenda for today is going to look like, we're going to start out by talking a little bit about what the state of the build out for grid scale storage in the PJM market actually stands at today. So how did we get here the last few years? How much installed capacity is there actually? What is the duration of those resources? And then ultimately, how is that going to be changing in the future? PJM's recently implemented some queue reforms. How much capacity do we think is going to be coming in the next half a decade or thereabouts? Then we're going to move into revenue streams for storage. How much revenue is actually potentially available for batteries across the three different revenue streams that they can broadly participate in, and how do they actually participate in those revenue streams? And then we're going to close out with a little bit of discussion on some of the hot topics in PJM today. What are some of the key policy changes that are potentially going to be impacting revenues long-term for batteries in PJM? And then ultimately, we're going to finish out with about 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A as well. So let's just jump into it. Diksha, I'm going to hand it over to you to start talking about the build out of storage in PJM.
Thank you, Ron. So let's start by setting the scene. The build out in PJM so far has been fairly limited, and we'll unpack the reasons as to why that is. Here, you're looking at installed and incremental battery energy storage systems, or BESS capacity in PJM over the years. PJM's build-out started somewhere around 2011 and has been slowly climbing since then. Today, the utility-scale battery capacity in PJM stands at a little over 400 megawatts. But that's pretty small in scale. Although PJM is the largest HST market in the US, we're talking peak demand somewhere in the range of 160 gigawatts, it only added about 200 megawatts of battery capacity in the last 5 years. When you compare that with other markets like ERCOT and CAISO, which added close to 20 gigawatts combined in the same stretch, that's pretty minimal. But not all that storage is spread across PJM evenly. If you look at the landscape here of PJM, which spans across 13 different states, as seen in the shaded map, you'll see that 65% of this total build-out is spread across just 3 states, basically New Jersey, Illinois, and Virginia. And what's really driving that is the state's energy storage procurement mandates or utility targets or any favorable incentive programs that they have in place. So far, as you can see, the build-out has been fairly minimal when you compare that with the total target, but we expect that picture to change in the near future. And that's largely because, as I mentioned, there are a lot of incentive programs that are starting to drive some of the future build-out. Now, if you take a little deeper and look at this build-out in terms of both weighted power as well as energy capacity over the years, you'll start to see a clear divergence between these two lines. The total energy capacity in PJM was considerably lesser than rated power back in 2020 when you think about it like one-to-one. And that was largely because PJM had many short duration batteries during that time, largely because they wanted to take advantage of the lucrative frequency regulation market in place. Most of those batteries back then were only 20 minutes or 25 minutes in duration. But in recent years, PJM has started adding some 2-hour duration sites, a couple of 4-hour duration. And so you're starting to see this average duration kind of creep up more towards 1 hour now.
Yeah, and if we think back to a year like 2020 when cell costs were quite a bit more expensive than they are today, it makes sense where, you combine that with the fact that, as we'll talk about in a moment, PJM is primarily a regulation-driven market when it comes to revenues, or at least it has been historically. So that less than 1 hour duration was feasible for batteries to still participate in the main revenue stream and really be able to earn their revenues. But like you mentioned, it's very much already starting to change. It's going to change even more moving forward.
Now let's dive deep into the main reason for why battery deployment has been so slow in this region. It's really the interconnection queue. There are 2 factors at play here. Firstly, PJM has seen very high attrition rates. Over 85% of the capacity that enter the queue withdraw after a certain point in time. Second, for the projects that do make it through, the time to reach commercial operations is increasing. This chart here shows how long it takes for the projects to move forward along the different study stages, like system impact, feasibility study, getting an interconnection service agreement, and finally reaching commercial operations. And you can see that for projects that had a COD before 2020, most of these projects are a median duration of anything between 2 to 4 years. But after 2020, across the board, all of these technologies took much longer to interconnect. Some projects took as long as 12 years to interconnect. But that's only half the picture. We're only talking about successful projects. There were also quite a lot of projects that were stranded in the queue for many years before they decided to withdraw. But the good news now is that queue reforms are underway to address these issues. So to clear PJM's backlog, PJM instituted the queue reform and moved from the first come, first served serial process to a first ready, first served cluster process. And during this transition, PJM created 3 interim cycles called the fast lane, transition cycle 1, and transition cycle 2. So projects that were submitted prior to 2018 went through the serial process under the old rules. But as you can see, projects that entered between 2018 through 2020 were grouped into either the fast lane, which was an expedited one-time process to go through any projects that had grid upgrade costs of under $5 million, or they were put into TC1. And post late 2020 to 2021, rest of the projects were clubbed into TC2, the transition cycle 2. Across these 3 cycles, you see about 18 gigawatts of total battery capacity. Rest of the projects that remain in the queue were forced to withdraw, and they ultimately have to be joined in the cycle 1, which is the new fully reformed queue that PJM will institute towards the end of next year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, how many new projects come into the queue ultimately under the new cycle design. But quite a lot of capacity in the coming years here.
For sure. So now zooming into just the fast lane batteries, as you saw in the queue earlier, there was 18 gigawatts in total. The fast lane is about 4 gigawatts of total capacity. And all of these batteries are further along in the process because they already have a signed connection agreement. So they give us a good view of what's really coming. And you can see on this chart here that when we looked at all of these projects that have disclosed their duration, most of the projects had over 60% of the capacity was actually 4-hour duration batteries, with many of them starting to trend towards 6 or 10-hour duration. So overall, we're seeing this trend that average duration across PJM fleet is increasing over time, but we do expect this to ramp up much faster. And that's largely because this move towards longer duration systems means that developers are looking beyond just capturing regulation market revenues, and they also wanted to move into the more lucrative capacity market. Very similar to what we saw in CAISO.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thinking back to that duration chart that we shared just a moment ago, that trend is certainly going to increase pretty quickly towards that 4+ hour mark as some of these projects come online. Those 10-hour projects are going to be really interesting to watch too. That's going to be a bit of a proving ground for what that extra long duration for lithium-ion projects can actually do when it comes to capturing revenue in some of the different markets that batteries are able to participate in.
Agreed. So just zooming a little bit back out now, what you're looking at here is our view of total BESS build-out, or at least the upper end of what's possible from the queue reform. So from the 18 gigawatts of battery capacity across all the 3 different cycles, we applied some assumed level of attrition and throughput rates, both based on historical trends as well as expectations of progress from this new process. We assumed that all the fast lane projects would come into fruition just because they have signed interconnection agreements, and we applied some moderate attrition for the transition cycles. That led to this total build-out as high as 7 gigawatts by 2030, and that's likely to remain if the existing revenue opportunities start to continue. But we do want to highlight a caveat that if some of the queue delays persist, then the timelines here could also slip up.
Yeah, it's highly dependent on that queue reform actually really coming to fruition to be able to get projects through the queue. But those fast line projects at the bare minimum should provide a really nice foundation over the next couple of years.
Certainly. So now that we've set the scene for battery energy storage build-out, let's talk about the meaty part, revenues.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of go high level here, we're going to talk about cumulative revenues earned over the last few years for storage resources that have actually been in operation in PJM. So what each of these lines represents is just one of the years since 2020, and each day along each of those lines represents an incremental amount of revenue being added to what the average battery was able to capture across each of these years. So a couple things to note here before we jump into what's happening in the slide. Being that the revenues being measured here are actually just the gross revenues, so that's not going to be inclusive of charging costs. That's just going to be a product of the fact that that's what the storage developers and other technology types are actually required to report in the quarterly reports that are informing this data. But moving beyond that, just kind of to get a sense of how revenue opportunities have evolved in the last few years. You see some of these down years like 2021, 2024 that are more of the kind of the typical. They don't have as much actual volatility relative to a couple of the more outlier years here, resulted in average revenues between $150 and $220 per kilowatt or thereabouts across the entire year for the average unit of capacity for a storage resource. Whereas if we look to 2022 and 2025, we see a bit more, obviously elevated revenue, and that is largely driven by two things. So the first of those being commodity prices. If we think back to 2022, we had the war in Ukraine impacting natural gas prices, as well as just elevated coal prices across much of the U.S. And that was combined with a couple of weather-driven volatility events. The biggest of those, obviously, being Winter Storm Elliott in December of 2022. Cold snap across much of the eastern U.S. drove demand extremely high, and ultimately we did observe some volatility there. Batteries were able to kind of capture some of that revenue. Similarly, in June of this year, we had a heat wave movement across much of the eastern U.S. and the mid-Atlantic, driving, again, demand extremely high. I think it was the highest recorded peak demand in well over a decade, and that provided a bit of that volatility that, of course, batteries thrive on. So if we think about where that revenue is actually coming from, historically it's been all about the regulation market in PJM. So regulation obviously just being that frequency response mechanism that's keeping frequency right around 60 hertz. Resources that are assigned that regulation responsibility move up or down to help correct that frequency, keep things balanced. For batteries, roughly 60 to 85% of their revenues in any given month tends to come from regulation, settling at around 73% of total earnings over the last 5 years or thereabouts. So yeah, that's a trend that's really continued all the way up through the middle of this year in 2025. If we think back to how much installed capacity there is in PJM, there's only around 424 megawatts of storage resources. And if we think about how that relates to the size of the market for regulation, as we'll talk about in a moment here, that's a lot smaller than the total market size. If we think about why that's led to such high revenues for batteries, we just look at the clearing prices here on this chart over the last few years. So these are going to be monthly average clearing prices of each of the three ancillary services in PJM, as well as the monthly around-the-clock price for energy as well. So if we look at that purple line in regulation, it's tracking very closely to the average energy price in PJM, which is not necessarily typical of most markets. Typically, you'd see a bit of a discount in terms of what that regulation clearing price is relative to energy. And of course, further to that, batteries don't just get paid, or resources don't just get paid for providing just the capacity payment of regulation in PJM. PJM actually pays out resources for the amount of throughput that they're expected to provide in any given interval in which they're providing regulation. They call that mileage. And in addition to that, they're also getting paid for performance. So resources that follow that regulation signal really well are going to be paid even more than resources that don't follow that signal quite as well, which batteries tend to have an extremely high performance rate when it comes to the regulation market. They tend to capture quite a bit of revenues there. So it's been a very lucrative revenue stream. You're talking about clearing prices in some months averaging above $50 per megawatt, which translates back to, if we think about that cumulative revenue slide from a moment ago, some of those relatively high revenues, even in those down years, of close to $200 per kilowatt, right? Now, again, like I mentioned, one of the caveats here, of course, is that this isn't something that we're necessarily expecting to last for a long time in the future. Like we mentioned, it's around 424 megawatts of installed capacity when it comes to batteries today. And PJM regularly procures somewhere between 600 or 700 megawatts of regulation on an average hourly basis. Now, that regulation procurement amount is unlikely to really rise too much in the future. PJM is revising how they're procuring the capacity and how they're determining procurement amounts hour to hour, but it's unlikely to change significantly going forward. Whereas, as Deeksha just mentioned a moment ago, our expectation is build-out is really about to start taking off as the queue reform really takes hold. The fast lane is likely to result in upwards of 4 gigawatts of projects by the end of the decade. And even if we look to just 2026 and 2027, we're talking about around 1 gigawatt of installed capacity by the end of next year, close to 2 gigawatts by the end of 2027, whereas that regulation requirement remains relatively fixed. So a larger number of resources competing for a similarly fixed volume of capacity. Ultimately, it's just going to result in increased competition. It's going to start to push those prices down. It's a phenomenon we've definitely seen in other markets, like in the U.S., CAISO and ERCOT. Whereas more batteries enter those markets, you started to see the ancillary service prices start to crater. We call that saturation. And that's something, we very much would expect to continue in PJM. One other note on the ancillary service side here is that if we think back to this previous chart with the actual clearing prices for some of the other services, the reserve services, Comparing again to other markets in ERCOT or CAISO, what we've seen is batteries typically, when regulation isn't as much of an option, would then try to pursue revenues in some of the other ancillary services. However, the clearing prices for those reserve services in PJM are already so saturated with other technology types like thermal generation resources that typically those clear at really low prices already. So there's not as much of a revenue opportunity for batteries to pursue once those regulation revenues potentially start to dry up in the coming years. All that to say that batteries are likely to have to start pursuing alternative revenue streams in PJM as soon as really next year, 2027. And so some of those alternative revenue streams, the first of those being capacity markets, right? So PJM has an annual auction that they conduct centrally. So what happens is, they have a certain amount of demand or reliability requirement that they're trying to procure enough supply for to ensure that when capacity is called upon, they have enough supply to meet those high demand days. So what's been happening, as we'll get into in just a second here, is demand has been rising quite a bit, whereas the supply has been remaining relatively stagnant. We talked about a lot of the queue delays. That's made it difficult to add more supply to the system. And ultimately, what that's resulted in is extremely high clearing prices in the last two capacity auctions. So what happens here is they conduct this centrally cleared yearly auction. Resources that clear in the market are awarded a certain amount of capacity responsibility, and they get paid for each megawatt that they're awarded. And the price here that we're showing is, in the last two auctions, we're talking about over $250 per megawatt day, which is, well over $60,000, $70,000 per megawatt over the course of an entire year for the average resource. So, that's something where if we think back into history, this is a significant departure from, the early part of this decade where capacity clearing prices were most of the time well below $100 per megawatt day. So this represents quite a bit of an elevated revenue opportunity if batteries are able to start capturing more of what the capacity market offers in terms of upside. Now, if we think about what's been driving this upward, as we just mentioned, there's been a significant increase in the amount of demand in PJM in the last couple of years. So thinking back to around 2020, we're talking about 150 gigawatts of peak demand. That's around where it hovered all the way back to 2015. But if we look to the last couple of years, we've seen that start to increase to the point where earlier this year in 2025, talking about late June, we had that heat wave where demand peaked around 161 gigawatts this year. And so that obviously represents one of the highest demand markers in over a decade. And that kind of corresponds to PJM seeing that they need to procure more and more demand in that capacity market. And if we look forward here on the demand side, you can see that PJM has been reacting in terms of what they're forecasting for demand growth looking forward. Each of these dotted lines represents a revised forecast looking forward into the future. The year attached represents the year in which that forecast was made. If we look at the 2025 forecast here, PJM's recent numbers would indicate that we're expecting upwards of 200 gigawatts in peak demand by as early as 2030. So that's obviously a substantial increase from where we are today with that 160 gigawatt number. So that's going to have a significant impact on those capacity market clearing prices. Now, the flip side of the capacity market, being that it is supply matching demand, is the supply side, right? So each of these stacked columns represents the amount of capacity that is qualified to receive awards in PJM's capacity markets. Now, you see that there's obviously a big drop between 2024, 2025, and the 25-26 auction year. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that PJM reevaluated the effective load carrying capabilities of the different technology types that participate in its capacity market. So essentially just saying, does this resource actually provide this proportion of its capacity consistently during the capacity events? And all that to say is essentially many of those technology types saw their ELCCs downgraded. So for instance, solar generation resources ended up having their ELCCs downgraded from, I think, around 20 or so percent to a little bit lower in recent auction years. And similarly, across other technology types, that happened, a similar phenomenon occurred, resulting in a significant decrease in qualified capacity. The other counter to that, of course, is also we've had a retirement of some of the thermal generation capacity in PJM in the last few years too. So particularly on the coal generation side, you can kind of see this dark orange bar here at the bottom, been a significant diminishing in how much actual coal capacity is going to be entering into the capacity market in each of these years. So, again, lower amounts of supply, increasing amounts of demand. Ultimately, that's been the driving force pushing up capacity prices in recent years. And thinking about how that translates to storage revenues, capturing, that $250, $300 per megawatt day price is going to translate into a significant amount of revenue for a storage resource. Of course, talking about ELCCs, major caveat there being that storage resources aren't going to be able to qualify to receive 100% of their capacity as an award in the capacity market, right? A 4-hour duration resource only has an ELCC of somewhere around 50%. So, it's only going to be able to receive, if it's a 100 megawatt resource, a capacity award of up to 50 megawatts and get paid for that. Now, the kind of third third arm of the revenue opportunity triangle here in terms of what batteries can pursue in PJM is going to be the energy arbitrage side. So we're talking about buying energy when it's cheap, selling it when it's high, capturing that intraday price spread. And we generally refer to that as energy arbitrage. So Disha, I'll let you kind of take that away.
Thanks, Brian. So the chart that you're looking at here is what we call the top-bottom spread, or TB spread, which measures the difference between the highest and the lowest prices in a day. It's a pretty good indication of what a battery could earn from price volatility. And TBX is basically the value that shows how that potential scales with increasing duration. So TB1, for example, represents a 1-hour battery capturing the single biggest price spread in a day, while TB4 would represent for a 4-hour battery capturing the 4 largest price differences. Now, if you look at 2025, you can see that spreads are clearly rising compared to prior years. This means that energy arbitrage opportunities have been improving. As Brad mentioned earlier, it's largely because of short-term scarcity and weather events, as well as high commodity prices that drove this trend upwards. Now, PJM isn't as volatile a market like ERCOT or CAISO, and that's largely because the renewable and battery adoption has been pretty low today. But price spikes also, for now, they don't last as long because it's a thermal heavy market. So unless solar generation really starts to pick up in this market, spreads are less driven by a structural price change as you see in CAISO. And you can also see that after TB4, or even after TB1 slowly, the spreads start to flatten. What that really means is that with longer duration, you start to see diminishing returns from arbitrage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the longer duration resources will have to be more focused on capturing an increased share of those capacity market revenue opportunities to be able to make those investments work for sure. So exactly. At least until potentially, like you mentioned with CAISO, if there's a significant build out of solar gen, then you might see some of that midday price valley that starts to enable longer spreads to really have, I guess, less of that diminishing return effect.
Agreed. So what you're looking at here is the 4-hour spread for locations where the fast lane battery projects are going to be built. And you can see that spreads are already elevated across the network for 2025 compared to the last year. But there's also a wide variation between the highest as well as the lowest paying nodes. Some sites have almost double the arbitrage potential of the other sites. On average, as you can see, the TB4 spreads rose from $47 per kilowatt per year in 2024 to $69 per kilowatt per year. And that represents a revenue potential boost of just 49% in 1 year. That uplift, as you can see, is consistent across most of the nodes.
Yeah, and we'll have to see how the rest of this year plays out too. Potential for, again, further weather-driven events as we start to get into winter here in 2025.
Right. Now, looking at the spreads, if you translate that across PJM on a map, this is how it looks. You can see clear hotspots. You start to see darker bubbles really in Northern Virginia and Eastern Maryland, where some of these nodes show spreads as high as $100,000 per megawatt per year. These areas tend to have high demand as well as high congestion, as largely because they rely on imports to serve concentrated demand where the data centers are located, which would drive heavy price swings. In contrast, if you take a look at New Jersey, you'll see that there are lighter bubbles there, and that's largely because this region is export constrained. And so transmission bottlenecks really limit the ability to move that excess generation out of the region, which would then flatten out any potential intraday price volatility. Even with that variation, developers are building batteries all across PJM's footprint. You see fast lane projects being built in New Jersey as well, which can benefit from the supportive policy program like the Garden State Energy Program, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, absolutely.
So switching gears a little bit, let's move on from revenues and let's talk about the key policy initiatives that could impact these revenues in the future.
Yeah, so just a couple of hot topics that we really want to touch on when it comes to what has the potential to change some of the revenue opportunities and revenue outcomes for batteries in PJM in the coming years. The first of those being on the near term side. So we talked a little bit about regulation and the fact that it's not likely to necessarily remain the primary revenue stream for batteries in the long term, but in the short term, until more batteries start to come into play, it is going to remain that primary revenue stream for storage. And alongside that, there's a significant amount of changes actually going on in the regulation market in PJM right now, largely categorized into two phases. So the first phase, ultimately what's happening there, and what's actually already happened here in the last couple of weeks, it went live at the beginning of October, was the separation of the two existing signals, into one combined signal. So you're taking the combined Reg A signal, which is typically designed for slower responding thermal generation resources, and the Reg D signal, which is more designed for those faster responding, newer technology types like storage resource. And you're combining that into just one procurement signal that ultimately everybody's going to be responding to and is expected to respond to in the same way when it comes to providing regulation. Now, some of the other changes that have been associated with the recent market design change are also going to be about how that performance aspect of payout is graded out. So previously, there was equal weighting given to how accurate you were in terms of just general direction in terms of response to the signal. If the signal is asking a resource providing regulation to increase its output and it responds to some extent, then they get graded positively for that, even if it's not incredibly precise in terms of the magnitude of the response that's expected. Similarly, with delay, that's going to be factored in less in the scoring now, where now going forward, it's going to be more of just that precision aspect of the scoring that's going to be the primary aspect in terms of determining that performance payout moving forward. And that's key because for batteries, they typically score extremely well when it comes to not only just the precision aspect, but really all aspects of the performance scoring. So that should be a positive signal in terms of their ability to capture larger amounts from the actual clearing prices that do exist when it comes to regulation. A couple of the other changes include moving from a 1-hour clearing process to a 30-minute clearing process. That increased granularity should allow for more flexibility for storage resources in terms of moving in and out of awarded regulation positions, maybe even moving into energy positions as they see fit. And a couple of the other potential changes being that PJM is actually going to be moving into procuring or determining the procurement requirements via a separate set of NERC standards, which has the potential to increase the amount of procured volume slightly. Now, if we think that all the way back to that slide where we're talking about install capacity relative to procured regulation amounts, we're not expecting that to be more than 100 or 200 megawatts in the typical hour. So by the time we get to 2026, late 2026 or 2027, when there's substantially more storage even still than that potentially upgraded regulation procurement amount, it likely won't make too much of a difference, but it could delay the onset of that saturation to some extent moving forward. Now, the second major change being made, all those changes we just kind of talked through are part of that first phase change that's happening as of today. And the second phase is going to be splitting up that single signal, which is kind of unique in PJM, where you only have one signal for regulation representing both moving frequency up and down. They're going to separate that up into a regulation up and a regulation down market, much more similar to a CAISO or an ERCOT that actually have those as two distinct products. That's going to be happening in late October of next year. And that's something where, there's probably pros and cons to that when it comes to storage resources. I think, having the two separate markets potentially could increase clearing prices because you have I guess just more segmentation of markets has the potential to result in a fragmentation of who's bidding where, right? But at the same time, each of those markets is likely to end up being smaller in size than the total amount of regulation procurement today. So less actual volume to be competing for. Now, the other major change we do want to speak to before we wrap up today is the low growth side. So we've obviously talked about how that's been a massive player and what's been causing a lot of the increases for capacity market clearing prices in recent years. Now, what we wanted to do was take a look at some of those forecasts that we also showed a little bit earlier, talking about 200 plus gigawatts in PJM for peak load by 2030, and really determine whether that seemed realistic. So what we did was we took a look at the actual queue reforms. We kind of applied our expectation, not just to what we saw with the batteries earlier, but also talking about the rest of technology types in the queue, trying to get an understanding of how much supply build out is actually realistic across the next 5 to 10 years. and compared that to some of those demand growth numbers. And what we determined was that a realistic amount of demand growth that can actually be achieved based on what our expectations of what could come out of the actual interconnection queue in the next few years is closer to around 180 gigawatts in peak demand, 185 gigawatts rather than that 200 gigawatt number by 2030. And I think we think that's really going to be pushing the envelope in terms of what the system can actually sustain. And some of that's going to be dependent on what the appetite is for having extremely high capacity clearing prices moving forward. Now, a couple of the things that have the potential to change exactly how much demand can actually be accommodated in PJM are, how some of these recent proposals, both from the system operator and some of the market participants, actually end up being handled. So the first of those being the PJM proposal, which was the non-capacity backed load, which essentially would see large loads removed from the capacity market in terms of their consideration, because the idea just being that if participating in the NCBL proposal, they would then have to be essentially self-curtailed during any capacity deployment events, right? So essentially they shouldn't show up in the amount of demand that PJM is trying to actually procure in those capacity markets. Now, of course, there's lots of pushback on that proposal, and the follow-up to that was from the market participants, a lot of the hyperscalers that are developing these data centers themselves. They submitted that follow-up that essentially their alternative solution would be to actually have those large loads, those data centers considered in the reliability requirement that PJM is trying to fulfill when it comes to the demand forecast moving forward. But also those demand centers would potentially be included in the supply stack for the capacity market, because essentially they're saying, yeah, we will be willing to curtail, but we want to be compensated for our willingness to do so in line with what the capacity market clearing price would stipulate. So essentially the capacity market prices are still really high, which is quite possible. I mean, I think our estimation is that if those resources are, have that high ELCC treated as demand response in the capacity market, they're not looking to really curtail very often. So I think they want to be compensated pretty heavily for it when doing so, right? So I don't necessarily know that that's going to have a huge downward pressure if they are included in the capacity market on those capacity market prices, because I think our expectation would be that they're going to be bidding in at relatively high values. So all that to say is I think our estimation is that long-term capacity market prices are likely to remain relatively elevated, and that ultimately how much demand is realistic is ultimately going to be constrained by how much supply can actually be built. So I think we'll kind of wrap it up there. I know that was a lot kind of in those last couple of slides. So we'll hand it over to some Q&A. So I think if we pull up that first one on stage here, awesome. So why do we think the average duration of the new BESS project is 4 hours versus 2 hours? Does it have anything to do with capacity market in the likes of CAISO versus no capacity market in ERCOT? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the primary thing that we're expecting is that the capacity market is really the thing that's driving up those durations, right? So if we think about what we were talking about when it came to effective load carrying capabilities earlier, we mentioned how a 4-hour duration storage resource has an ELCC of 50%, and a 10-hour duration resource has an ELCC of around 75%, right? So in terms of what they can be awarded in the capacity market, that 4-hour duration resource, for every megawatt that it has of installed capacity, it can only receive a half megawatt that actually clears in the capacity market. So the longer duration your storage resource is, the larger proportion of that resource in terms of its rated power is actually going to be able to clear in the capacity market. You can earn more revenues there. And yeah, just like what we've seen in CAISO, where resource adequacy markets in CAISO kind of stipulate that you really need to be around 4 hours or more in duration to be able to take advantage of those markets. And if we contrast that to ERCOT, where there is no capacity function, it's similar to what PJM has been historically. Most of the batteries initially were around 1 hour in duration, just trying to play on those ancillary service markets. And then as ERCOT in recent years has started to transition more towards an energy arbitrage focused market, that's started to see duration start to tick up to the point where they're around 1.5, 2 hours typically today. But yeah, definitely a capacity market driver as of today.
Yeah, and adding to that, we also recently did an article on the latest capacity market auction results, and we saw that about 4 batteries were actually cleared, and the revenue boost potential from just this revenue stream is pretty significant, at least 20% as of the latest market trends.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that plays into the idea of the fast lane projects as well, being largely 4 hour, 10 hour in duration.
Right.
Yeah.
If PJM pays for mileage in regulation and clearing price is very close to energy, why would a BESS choose regulation over energy? So this is largely a function of how the regulation markets really played out. So PJM would pay resource for three different revenue streams. Firstly, the capability payment, and then they would pay for mileage, and lastly, lost opportunity cost. But across all of this, like all of the three different components make up the regulation market clearing price. But for all the components, PJM actually applies that performance score that we were talking about earlier. And so batteries, considering they have very high precision, they can closely track the signal and they can follow pretty quickly, they rank much higher in this performance scoring. And so since that performance scoring is sort of weighted and applied across all of the three components, they already get quite a lot of revenue when you compare them with other like thermal resources or hydro in the market.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, in terms of why you would ultimately end up choosing regulation over energy, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that you can stack regulation payments across an entire day as well. So, even though PJM is compensating you extra for the mileage and for that performance and that lost opportunity cost and everything too. But beyond that, you're not going to have consistent deployment of regulation throughout the day, especially during some hours of the day. You might not actually have that much ramping, and therefore there's not as much frequency movement around 60 hertz. So the expectation for a given resource providing regulation may not result in quite as much cycling as or at least it might not result in quite as much throughput that you can't provide it for multiple consecutive hours. So if you have, 5, 6, 7 consecutive hours where the clearing price is, $30, $40, $50 per megawatt, then you can stack all those hours together. Whereas if the spread in PJM on that same day, if the average energy price is, again, around $50 around the clock for that entire 24-hour period, the spread that battery is able to capture is likely going to end up being a little bit lower than what they're able to earn in terms of that regulation payment. So that's why typically I think we see BESS, as of now, choosing regulation over energy.
Right. Is your reserve margin for 2025, 2026, and 2026, 27 the install reserve margin? If it is just the RM, did you use average or marginal ELCC? So for the slide prior, when we were showing the capacity stack, which is a cleared capacity stack against the target reserve margin and what the market actually landed at, we did use the installed reserve margin because that's typically how PJM's capacity market really functions. The installed reserve margin for the latest auction was somewhere around 20%, I believe. We did apply the average ELCCs that PJM actually posted for this auction and also benchmark that against the auction results to really stack up our supply.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right, so that's it for question and answer today. Thanks for joining our live stream.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming. Really appreciate all the questions and engagement. And if you'd like a copy of the slides, we're going to be sending them out via an email afterwards, and they're going to be available on the Modo Energy Terminal as well. We're going to be posting up a follow-up article with a lot of the key takeaways from the live stream. So be sure to be on the lookout. And once again, thanks for joining. We really appreciate it. Have a great one.